My name is Marissa Hale. I am 34 years old, and if you ask my parents, I am the daughter who never measured up. I wasn't the golden child like my younger sister, Elise, who always had her picture on the family wall. I wasn't the obedient one who lived to please either. No, I was the daughter who had dreams they laughed at. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside of Dallas, in a house where respect wasn't given but demanded, and where love felt more like a transaction than something unconditional. My parents treated Elise like royalty, but me? I was their servant. I cleaned the kitchen while Elise rehearsed for choir. I scrubbed the floors while Elise picked out prom dresses with Mom. And when Thanksgiving or Christmas rolled around, I was expected to cook and host like a maid while they entertained guests in the living room. I thought maybe things would change when I got older, but nothing did. Even at 34, with my own apartment, my own career, and my own hard-earned independence, Mom and Dad still spoke to me like I was 12. They didn't see me as an adult, they saw me as the help. It was the night before Thanksgiving when the real blow came. Mom called me, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, but her words sharp as knives. "Marissa," she said, "your sister's friends are spending Thanksgiving here. It's only 20 people. You'll cook, clean, set up the dining room, and make sure everything's perfect. Elise needs to focus on greeting the guests." She didn't ask. She commanded. Just like always. But this time, something inside me shifted. I wasn't a scared little girl anymore. I wasn't the invisible daughter desperate for approval. I was a woman who had worked hard, built something for herself, and carried a secret that neither Mom nor Dad had the faintest clue about. I smiled through the phone, keeping my voice calm. "Sure, Mom. Don't worry. I'll take care of everything." That night, I packed my suitcase and booked a ticket to Los Angeles. While they thought I would be slaving away in their kitchen, I was already on a plane to California. When they walked into their house the next day, expecting the smell of roasted turkey and baked pies, all they found was an empty kitchen. No table set, no food, no decorations. And while Mom's face turned pale with shock, she didn't know the biggest surprise of all was still waiting for her. Growing up in the Hale household was like living in a play where my role was written before I was even born. Elise, my younger sister, was the star. She was the singer, the social butterfly, the girl with the sparkling smile that made my parents beam with pride. And me? I was the stagehand, the one who set the scene, made everything work, but never got to take a bow. I remember one Christmas when I was 16. Elise wanted a silver bracelet from the mall, and I wanted a set of paints. I loved art back then, dreamed of becoming an illustrator. On Christmas morning, Elise unwrapped the bracelet in front of the family, Mom squealing, Dad clapping like it was the crown jewel. When it was my turn, I opened my gift to find a set of cleaning supplies. A broom, dustpan, and dish gloves. Mom laughed, saying, "Well, at least you'll always have something useful." Elise giggled. Dad didn't even look up from his coffee. That was the day I realized my parents didn't see me as their daughter. They saw me as their help. And the worst part? I accepted it. For years. I cooked Thanksgiving dinners while my mother took credit. I cleaned the house before Elise's birthday parties while Dad told the guests we hired a maid. The sting of their words followed me into adulthood. But when I turned 26, something inside me snapped. I had just graduated from college with a degree in business, but instead of congratulating me, Dad said, "Maybe now you can finally put that education to use. Help your sister with her event planning business." That was the night I packed my bags and left home for good. I moved into a tiny apartment in Austin, working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. But I never called home, not once. I promised myself I'd build a life so far away from their control that one day, they'd have no choice but to see me for who I really was. And I did. But I never told them. Now, sitting on that plane to Los Angeles the night before Thanksgiving, I thought about all those years of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. My parents had no idea who I had become. They thought I was still their servant. But the truth? The truth was about to hit them like a storm. Because the CEO they were desperate to impress, The man whose opinion they valued more than their own daughters was about to walk into their lives. And when he did, he wouldn't be shaking my father's hand. He'd be calling me boss. 2 years before that Thanksgiving flight, I attended a networking dinner that would change my life. At the time, I was working as a junior analyst at a small firm in Austin. My boss invited me along to a corporate mixer at a downtown hotel. I almost didn't go. I felt out of place, still carrying the old belief that I wasn't good enough for the table. But something told me to show up. That night, the room shimmered with polished shoes, crisp suits, and people who spoke in terms of millions and billions. I remember holding a glass of water, too nervous to order wine, and standing quietly by the wall. Then, out of nowhere, a tall man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes approached me. His presence was commanding, the kind that made the room go still when he spoke. "You look like someone who's observing instead of pretending," he said with a half smile. I laughed nervously. Or maybe I just don't belong here. He studied me for a long moment. "That's where you're wrong. People who think they don't belong are usually the ones who should be running the room." His name was Charles Whitman, CEO of Whitman Strategies, one of the most influential consulting firms in the country. Instead of brushing me off like so many others did, he asked questions about my ideas, my vision, my frustrations. By the end of the night, he handed me his card. "Call me when you're ready to stop thinking small," he said. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage, but when I finally called, he answered. That single call led to mentorship, doors opening, and within 2 years, me launching my own boutique consulting agency with his backing. I worked day and night, sacrificed weekends, and built something real, something mine. And yet, I never told my family. I knew exactly what would happen if I did. They would downplay it, mock it, or try to claim my success as their own. So, I stayed silent. To them, I was still the servant daughter. That's why the irony was so sharp. Because the very man my parents dreamed of impressing, the man they thought was out of my league, wasn't just a mentor anymore. He was my business partner. And they were about to find out the truth in the most humiliating way possible. Thanksgiving morning arrived, and while my parents fussed over the guest list, the decorations, and Elise's hair, I was already landing in Los Angeles. I checked into a small hotel in Santa Monica, ordered room service, and for the first time in years, felt free. Back in Dallas, the Hale house was buzzing like a stage before curtain call. Mom wore her pearl necklace, the one she only pulled out when she wanted to impress. Dad polished the dining table himself, muttering about appearances. And Elise? She twirled around in a gold dress, sipping on wine, practicing her charming laugh in the mirror. The centerpiece of their performance was not the turkey or the decorations. It was Charles Whitman. My parents had heard through the grapevine that Charles had recently moved some of his investments into Dallas. He was rumored to be scouting local talent, searching for new partnerships. To them, this was their big chance, an opportunity to rub shoulders with someone powerful. If they impressed him, it would elevate their status in every social circle that had ever doubted them. "Marissa better not screw this up," Mom whispered sharply as she adjusted the napkins. "If she ruins dinner, I swear." But when she stepped into the kitchen, the truth hit her like a slap. The counters were empty. The oven cold. No pies, no turkey, no food at all. Her face drained of color. "Elise," she shrieked. "Where's your sister? Why isn't anything ready?" Elise shrugged, sipping her wine. "I don't know. Isn't that her job?" Panic rippled through the house. Guests started arriving, trickling into the living room with bottles of wine and wide smiles, expecting a feast. Mom kept excusing herself, running back into the barren kitchen, her nerves unraveling. By 6 o'clock, the living room was full, the dining table empty. That's when the door opened, and in walked Charles Whitman, tall and commanding as ever. The room fell silent. My parents rushed toward him, plastering smiles over their panic, acting as though everything was perfectly under control. "Mr. Whitman," Dad said, gripping his hand, "welcome to our home. We are so honored you could join us." Charles glanced around the room. His eyes flicked toward the untouched dining table. He didn't say a word, but the faint lift of his brow said everything. My mother's voice trembled as she tried to explain. Dinner is delayed, but we'll have everything ready soon. My daughter Marissa is taking care of it. Charles's head tilted slightly. Marissa? For the first time all night, my parents smiled with genuine pride because they thought I was still in the kitchen, slaving away for them. Yes, Mom said quickly. She handles the work. Charles's smile spread slowly, like he was in on a joke no one else understood. And in that moment, my parents had no idea how badly their performance was about to collapse. The Hale living room buzzed with nervous chatter as guests balanced half-empty glasses of wine. My parents scurried around, stalling for time, offering crackers and fruit, anything to distract from the fact that Thanksgiving dinner didn't exist. But Charles Whitman wasn't distracted. He sat calmly in the center of it all, his presence heavy, his eyes sharp as he watched everything. He hadn't said much yet, but every time his gaze drifted toward the empty dining table, Mom's smile grew tighter, Dad's laugh louder, Elise's charm more desperate. Finally, Charles set his glass down and leaned back in his chair. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. So, where's Marissa? The room fell silent. My mother clasped her pearls nervously. Dad cleared his throat. She's in the kitchen, Mom said quickly. She handles all the work really. She's not one for the spotlight, you know. A faint smile tugged at Charles's lips. He looked from Mom to Dad, then to Elise, who twirled her wine glass with a smug little grin. That's interesting, Charles said slowly. Because the Marissa I know doesn't belong in the kitchen. The words dropped like a thunderclap. Conversations froze. Glasses hovered midair. Mom blinked, her painted smile faltering. I don't understand, she stammered. You know, our Marissa? Charles nodded, leaning forward now. His voice carried a weight that made the whole room lean in. Yes, he said. Your daughter, Marissa Hale, founder and managing partner of Hale Strategies. My business partner. Gasps rippled through the room. Elise nearly dropped her wine. My father's jaw went slack, his face pale. My mother shook her head in disbelief. No, that's not possible. Marissa? Our Marissa? She doesn't. But Charles cut her off, his tone firm. She does. And she does it well. In fact, I wouldn't be here tonight if it weren't for her. She is the reason I've invested in Dallas. She is the reason I'm even considering new partnerships. Silence stretched like a rope pulled too tight. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, Charles leaned back, his piercing eyes locked on my parents. So tell me, he said, his smile now edged with steel, why is it that the woman you've raised to serve your table is the very same woman who signs mine? The question hung in the air, and with it, the weight of their shame. And in that moment, my parents' carefully built performance, every fake smile, every pretentious plan, crumbled before their guests' eyes. The room stayed frozen, like everyone was afraid to breathe. My mother's face flushed crimson, her perfect Thanksgiving fantasy unraveling thread by thread. Dad coughed into his hand, trying to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. Elise's wine glass trembled, the golden girl suddenly stripped of her shine. Well, Mom stammered, clutching her pearls, that's just lovely. Of course, we're so proud of Marissa. She's always been helpful. Charles raised an eyebrow. Helpful? That's not the word I'd use. Visionary. Driven. Strategic. Those are the words I'd choose. Guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering behind their hands. Some smirked, others stared at my parents with open pity. For a family that prided themselves on appearances, this was death by humiliation. Dad leaned forward, forcing a laugh that sounded like it belonged to a man drowning. Well, Charles, you know how kids are. They grow up, surprise you sometimes. But Charles wasn't letting go. Funny, he said calmly, she never surprised me. From the moment I met Marissa, I knew she was meant to lead. The words landed like a hammer and the room erupted in murmurs. That's when Elise stepped forward, her eyes darting, her voice syrupy sweet, but edged with panic. Oh, well, I've always supported my sister, of course, she said, placing a hand over her heart. In fact, we were just talking about ways she could maybe, lend her expertise to my event planning business. She's very lucky to have me guiding her." The lie slid off her tongue so smoothly that some of the guests almost nodded along. But Charles's expression didn't budge. He looked at Elise the way a wolf looks at a rabbit pretending to be a lion. "Guiding her?" he asked softly. "Interesting. Because from what I've seen, Marissa doesn't need anyone's guidance. In fact, she's been guiding others, including me." Elise's cheeks burned red. She opened her mouth to speak, but Charles had already turned his gaze back to my parents. "You know," he said, his voice low and cutting, "in my world, the way you treat people matters more than the mask you wear at dinner. And tonight, it's very clear to me where your values lie." Silence followed, heavier than before. Mom and Dad exchanged a frantic glance, like two actors forgetting their lines under the blinding spotlight. Their masks were cracking, and everyone in the room could see it. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that their humiliation had only just begun. The air inside the Hale living room felt like glass, fragile, sharp, ready to shatter with one wrong word. My parents clung to their smiles like drowning swimmers clutching driftwood. Elise pouted in her gold dress, desperate to claw back attention. But Charles wasn't done. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the table, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "Appearances," he said, "can be a dangerous thing. People waste their lives trying to look important, when true power isn't about how you look, it's about what you build." Guests nodded silently, eyes flicking between him and my parents. Mom's hands shook as she tried to refill a glass of wine that was already full. "Your daughter, Marissa," Charles continued, "built something from nothing. She didn't ask for handouts. She didn't beg for approval. She created a company that is now one of the most promising consulting agencies in Dallas. She did that on her own, without any help from this house." Mom's face drained of color. Dad's jaw locked tight. Elise swallowed hard, her charm crumbling like paper in the rain. Charles let the silence linger, his gaze sweeping the room. "And yet, tonight, I hear her spoken about as though she's, what did you say? Helpful. As though she's staff in her own family's home. That tells me more about your values than you probably wanted me to know." A low murmur rippled through the guests, words like shameful and unbelievable floating through the air. Mom's smile twitched, a crack splitting across her perfect mask. Dad tried to salvage it. We didn't mean it that way, of course. We love Marissa. She's just not here right now to explain herself." But Charles shook his head, his smile faint and knowing. "She doesn't need to be here. Her work speaks for her." The words hit like a verdict. The kind you couldn't appeal, couldn't spin, couldn't twist. And while my parents sat frozen in their shame, I was sitting in a quiet hotel room in Los Angeles, curled up by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sun set over the Pacific. My phone buzzed with updates from colleagues who had been at that dinner, texts filled with laughter and disbelief at the scene unfolding back home. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I felt powerful, not because I had humiliated them, but because I hadn't needed to lift a single finger. Charles had done it for me. And yet, deep down, I knew the night wasn't over. My parents were desperate people. They would try to claw their way back from this. And Elise, she wasn't done fighting for her throne. But they had no idea that the quiet girl they dismissed all her life had already won. The living room had grown heavy with silence, broken only by the clinking of glasses and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. My parents sat stiffly, pale and humiliated, while the guests whispered behind their hands. For a family that lived for appearances, this was social death. But Elise wasn't ready to let the night end that way. She stood up, her golden dress shimmering under the chandelier, and forced a laugh that rang too loud, too false. "Well," she said, flashing her practiced smile, "what Charles means to say is that our family has always been proud of Marissa. She's done some cute little business things, yes, but let's not forget the real talent in the Hale family." All eyes turned toward her. She stretched her arms wide like a performer taking the stage. "I've built my own event planning brand," she continued, her voice dripping with sugar. "I've hosted galas, fundraisers, weddings, things that people in this room have probably attended. And maybe Marissa helped a little behind the scenes, but the truth is, we Hale women are a team. The lie dangled in the air, fragile and desperate. Some guests exchanged looks, trying not to laugh. Others sipped their drinks, waiting for Charles's response. Charles, however, didn't smile. He didn't nod. He didn't clap. He leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Elise like she was a child caught sneaking candy before dinner. "Funny," he said softly, "because I've never heard of your business. But Marissa's? I hear about it in boardrooms. I hear about it in investment meetings. I hear about it from clients who are proud to work with her." Elise's smile wavered, her face turning blotchy red. She tried again, her voice sharp now. "Well, maybe that's because I don't need to brag about my work. I let it speak for itself." A ripple of laughter spread through the room, quick and cruel. The guests weren't buying it. Elise's mask was slipping, just like our parents. Charles's expression didn't change, but his words cut her down to size. Marissa never bragged either. She just worked harder than everyone else. That's why I trust her. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elise stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides, her golden dress suddenly feeling more like a costume than a crown. Mom tried to rescue her, mumbling something about Elisa's natural charm, but it was too late. The guests had already seen the truth. Elise wasn't the star she believed herself to be. And while they all scrambled, trying to salvage their reputations, I sat miles away in Los Angeles, sipping tea and smiling to myself. For once, I didn't need to be in the room to win. My absence was louder than my presence ever could have been. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. My parents and Elise would not go quietly. And when they tried to fight back, they'd only bury themselves deeper. By the time dessert should have been served, the Hale home was suffocating under the weight of its own silence. Guests whispered, exchanged glances, and quietly checked their watches, waiting for an excuse to leave. But my parents weren't about to let the night collapse without a fight. Dad stood, puffing out his chest as if sheer confidence could glue the broken pieces of their image back together. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, raising his glass, "I think there's been some confusion tonight. Of course, we're proud of Marissa. She's done well for herself. But let's not exaggerate things. This is still her home. This is still a Hale family table." He glanced nervously at Charles, forcing a shaky laugh. "And we've always believed in hard work, in tradition, in keeping family first. That's what tonight is about. Not business deals. Not power." Mom nodded quickly, her smile stretched tight as a mask. "Yes, exactly. Family. That's why Elise shines, why Marissa, well, why she's always been a wonderful helper. We raised them both to serve others, not to chase titles." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. A murmur of discomfort ran through the guests. Some shook their heads. Others sipped their drinks, eyes wide at the audacity. Charles didn't move at first. He let the silence stretch until my parents squirmed in it, their false pride wilting under the weight of judgment. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet. "Serve others." His voice was low, controlled, but it carried across the room. Interesting choice of words. Because what I see are two people who've spent their lives teaching one daughter she's a star, and the other that she's invisible. And now, when the invisible one outshines you all, you call it exaggeration. My father's mouth opened, but no words came out. Mom's face was frozen in a smile that looked more like a grimace. Elise stared at the floor, her golden dress suddenly dull under the chandelier. Charles raised his glass, his eyes sharp as steel. "Here's the truth. Marissa Hale doesn't need this table. She doesn't need your approval. She's already built something bigger than this house, bigger than this room, bigger than this little performance. And the only thing she ever had to overcome was you." The words hit like thunder. Guests gasped. One woman clapped her hand over her mouth. Another shook her head, whispering unbelievable. For the first time in my life, my parents couldn't talk their way out of it. No charm, no smile, no excuse could erase what had just been said. Their masks shattered completely, and the room saw them for what they were: selfish, shallow, and small. And while they stood there, exposed and trembling, Charles raised his glass one last time. To Marissa, he said. The real Hale worth knowing. The guests clinked their glasses. My parents didn't move. Elise's eyes brimmed with tears. And hundreds of miles away, I sat in my hotel room in Los Angeles, phone buzzing with message after message. You won tonight. Without even being there. But the sweetest part wasn't just that they had been humiliated. It was that they had humiliated themselves. The fallout from that disastrous Thanksgiving night rippled through town like wildfire. By Monday morning, my phone buzzed nonstop with messages from neighbors, old classmates, even distant relatives who had heard every detail. The Hales, once untouchable in their little social circle, were now the talk of every whispered conversation. But I stayed quiet. I didn't need to gloat. Their unraveling was already happening without me lifting a finger. 2 weeks later, I returned to my hometown, not to visit them, but to finalize a project I had been planning long before that Thanksgiving dinner. I walked into the old Hale Community Center, a crumbling building my parents always bragged about supporting, though they never actually donated a dime. Over the years, they'd plastered their names on plaques, on walls, on brochures, claiming credit for work they didn't do. Now, it was under new sponsorship. My sponsorship. The director greeted me warmly. Everything's ready, Miss Hale. Would you like the honor? I nodded and picked up the velvet cloth. With one smooth pull, the plaque was revealed. Hale Community Center, renovated and sponsored by the Marissa Hale Foundation. And beneath it, a smaller inscription. Dedicated to those overlooked, underestimated, and silenced, but who rise anyway. The old plaques with my parents' names had already been taken down, stripped from the walls, tossed in a storage closet where no one would ever see them again. Poetic. Clean. Permanent. That evening, I received a call. My father's voice was sharp, almost frantic. You think this little stunt makes you better than us? You think erasing our name gives you power? I let his words wash over me, calm and steady. Then I said the one thing he'd never expected to hear. No, Dad. I don't need power over you. I just don't need you at all. There was silence on the other end. Heavy. Final. I hung up and turned my phone face down, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Because in the end, the revenge wasn't in humiliating them or erasing their names from a wall. The real victory was this. They no longer had the power to define me. I had built something on my own, something lasting, something no one could take away. And while they spent the rest of their lives clinging to a reputation that had already slipped through their fingers, I was already moving forward, free, untouchable, and, finally, whole.